Some friendships are supposed to last forever, Steve. But what happens when forever gets cut short? Michael B. Jordan's question silenced everyone in the Family Feud studio. America's most beloved actor couldn't cope with his best friend's death, and he was searching for answers in Steve Harvey. The studio lights hummed their familiar electric whisper as another celebrity episode of Family Feud prepared to begin. Golden spotlights carved sharp shadows across the polished floor, while the iconic blue and gold logo gleamed overhead like a beacon of American entertainment. The audience buzzed with anticipation, phones already recording, expecting the usual mix of laughter and friendly competition that made these celebrity episodes so beloved. In the contestant seats, Michael B. Jordan sat with his team, fellow actors who had come to support their friend in what was supposed to be a light-hearted charity game. Ryan Coogler, his director and close friend, had insisted he needed this. "You need to get out there, man. Chad would want you to be around people who care about you." But as Michael adjusted his tie for the third time in 10 minutes, he wondered if he was ready for the cameras, the questions, the inevitable comparisons to the man who would never sit beside him again. But Michael wasn't thinking about charity. He wasn't thinking about the cameras, or the audience, or even the game they were about to play. For 3 years, 8 months and 12 days, he had been carrying a weight that no amount of success could lift. The weight of words left unsaid, the weight of a goodbye he never got to give. The last conversation replayed in his mind constantly, like a broken record he couldn't turn off. Chadwick had called him from the hospital, his voice weak but still carrying that familiar warmth. "Keep being great, brother," he had said. "The world needs more Michael B. Jordan." Michael had laughed it off, promised to visit soon, told him to focus on getting better. Neither of them had said "I love you." Neither of them had said goodbye. 3 days later, the world lost a king, and Michael lost the person who believed in him before he believed in himself. Steve Harvey emerged from backstage, his signature charcoal suit impeccable, his smile wide and welcoming. 27 years of hosting had taught him to read a room in seconds, to sense the energy that would shape the next hour of television. The audience erupted in applause, but as his eyes swept across the contestants, something made him pause. There was a heaviness in Michael's posture that the cameras couldn't quite capture, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes focused somewhere beyond the present moment. It was the same look Steve had seen in his own mirror years ago, after losing his father. The look of someone carrying a conversation they'd never get to finish. "Welcome back to Family Feud." Steve's voice boomed through the studio. "Tonight we got some special folks with us, led by the one and only Michael B. Jordan." The crowd cheered, but Michael's smile felt like a performance he'd been giving for years. As the applause died down, Steve continued with his characteristic warmth. "Now, Michael, I gotta ask, you've played some tough guys on screen. Boxers, soldiers, even royalty. But are you ready for the toughest challenge of all, Family Feud?" The audience laughed, and for a moment, Michael felt the familiar comfort of scripted banter. This he could handle. This was safe territory where emotions stayed hidden behind professional smiles and practiced responses. The first few rounds passed in typical fashion. Laughter echoed through the studio as Steve delivered his trademark reactions to unexpected answers. Michael played along, his professionalism intact, but those watching closely could see the distance in his eyes, as if part of him remained somewhere else entirely. During commercial breaks, he would touch the small silver pendant around his neck, a gift from Chadwick during the filming of Black Panther. "For strength," Chad had said, fastening it himself. "For when you need to remember who you really are." The production assistants called for quiet as they prepared for the fourth round. The energy in the studio had been building steadily, the kind of rhythm that made for great television. But something was about to shift, something none of them could have anticipated. It was during the fourth round when everything changed. The question appeared on the board. "Name something you wish you could tell someone who's no longer with us." The studio fell unusually quiet. Even Steve seemed to sense the shift in energy as he looked at Michael, who had gone completely still at his podium. The countdown clock ticked in the background, but time seemed suspended. This wasn't just any question, it was the question that had been haunting Michael for years, written on a game show board as if the universe had been waiting for this exact moment. The other contestants looked between Michael and the board, recognizing the sudden weight in the room. Ryan Coogler, standing behind Michael, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension radiating from his friend's body. "Michael?" Steve's voice was gentler now, instinctively responding to something he couldn't quite name. "What do you think?" Michael's hands gripped the podium edge. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he looked up, meeting Steve's eyes across the stage. Can I say something real, Steve?" The question hung in the air like incense. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of episodes, fielded millions of answers, but something in Michael's voice made him set his cards down entirely. "Of course, man. What's on your heart?" Michael took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. "Some friendships are supposed to last forever, Steve. But what happens when forever gets cut short?" The silence that followed was absolute. 300 people held their breath as one of Hollywood's strongest men began to crack open on live television. "I lost my best friend 3 years ago," Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow reaching every corner of the studio. "Chadwick Boseman. And there's so much I never got to say to him, so much I never got to tell." His voice cracked on the name, the way it always did when he spoke it aloud. The cameras captured every nuance, the way his hands trembled slightly, the way he unconsciously touched that silver pendant, the way his breath caught on words that had been trapped inside him for too long. Steve Harvey, the man famous for always having the perfect comeback, found himself speechless. In all his years of television, through every unexpected moment and surprising revelation, he had never felt the air in a studio change quite like this. He watched as Michael's composure finally shattered, tears beginning to trace down his cheeks. "I never told him how much he saved me, Steve. How many times his friendship kept me going when I wanted to quit everything. I never told him that every time I stepped on a movie set, I was trying to make him proud. I never—" Michael's voice broke completely. "I never told him I loved him like a brother." The raw honesty of the moment sent ripples through the audience. This wasn't the polished Michael B. Jordan they knew from red carpets and interviews. This was a man stripped bare by grief, standing in the harsh light of television studio floods, bleeding truth in front of strangers. People in the audience began reaching for tissues, for each other's hands, recognizing their own unspoken regrets in his words. The cameras continued rolling, but everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something far beyond entertainment. This was a man's soul breaking open, live and unfiltered, in the audience. People began to cry, not the polite, contained emotion of a typical taping, but the raw, unguarded response to witnessing authentic human pain. Steve Harvey did something he had never done in 40 years of television. He walked away from his podium. The move was so unexpected that the camera operators had to quickly adjust their angles. He crossed the stage slowly, deliberately, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor with each measured step. His eyes never left Michael's face, reading the geography of grief written there. When he reached the other side, he didn't stop at the contestant area. He stepped directly in front of Michael and placed both hands on his shoulders. "Son," Steve said, his own voice thick with emotion, "let me tell you something about love and friendship in the words we think we never said." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the lights became audible again. "You think Chadwick didn't know?" Steve continued. "You think a man doesn't feel it when his best friend tries to make him proud every single day? You think he didn't see the love in every role you took, every choice you made, every time you spoke his name with reverence?" Michael's tears fell freely now, but he didn't look away. "The words you think you never said? They were spoken every day you lived like he taught you to live. Every time you honored his memory by being the man he knew you could be. Every time you carried his legacy forward in your own work and your own life." Steve's own eyes were glistening now. In his decades of hosting, he had learned that the most powerful moments came not from jokes or games, but from the spaces between words where human truth lived. "You know what your friend saw in you, Michael? He saw a man who would carry love forward even when it hurt. He saw someone who would honor friendship not with perfect words, but with a lifetime of right action." The audience was crying now, not the manufactured emotion of television, but the raw recognition of universal human pain. "But Steve," Michael whispered, What if I failed him? What if I didn't live up to what he saw in me? Steve Harvey smiled then. Not his television smile, but something softer and infinitely more real. Michael, let me ask you something. When you think about Chadwick, when you really think about him, what do you see? I see strength, Michael answered without hesitation. I see kindness. I see a man who never let success change his heart. And what do you think he sees when he looks down at you? The question settled over Michael like a revelation. For the first time in 3 years, he seemed to truly consider it. He sees those same things, doesn't he? That's right, Steve said firmly. He sees the man he helped shape. He sees his best friend carrying his values forward every single day. He sees love in action, not just in words. Steve pulled Michael into an embrace then, right there on the Family Feud stage, with cameras rolling and America watching. It wasn't planned or scripted or approved by any producer. It was simply one human being, holding another in his moment of greatest need. Chadwick knows, son, Steve whispered into the embrace. He knows because every day you wake up trying to be worthy of his friendship, you're telling him everything he needs to hear. When they separated, both men were changed. Michael stood straighter, his eyes clearer than they had been in years. Steve had tears on his cheeks, but his smile was radiant. You know what we're gonna do? Steve announced to the studio. We're gonna finish this game, and we're gonna play it like Chadwick is right here cheering us on. 'Cause the greatest way to honor a friend's memory isn't to carry guilt, it's to carry joy. The remainder of the episode became something unprecedented in television history. The game continued, but it had transformed into a celebration of friendship, of legacy, of the way love transcends death. Michael played with a lightness that seemed to surprise even him, laughing genuinely for the first time in the footage anyone had seen of him in years. The other contestants followed his lead, the entire atmosphere shifting from competition to communion. During one particularly funny moment, when a teammate gave an absurd answer about things you find in a superhero's refrigerator, Michael doubled over with laughter and looked up at the ceiling. You hear that, Chad? He whispered, just loud enough for the microphones to catch, still making people laugh. It was the first time in 3 years he had spoken to his friend aloud, and somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the world. But the moment that broke the internet came during the final Fast Money round. Steve asked Michael, "Name something that never truly dies." Without hesitation, Michael answered, "Love between friends." The answer lit up the board as the #1 response, and the studio erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. But Michael wasn't looking at the scoreboard or basking in the crowd's reaction. He was looking up at the lights above, his lips moving in a silent conversation only he could hear. Later, lip readers would decode his words. "We did it, Chad. We finally finished that conversation." The victory meant their team won $25,000 for charity, but everyone in that studio understood they had witnessed something worth far more than money. They had seen the moment when grief transformed into gratitude, when loss became legacy, when a man found his way back to joy through the simple act of being seen and heard without judgment. After the cameras stopped rolling, the studio didn't immediately empty as it usually did. People lingered, reluctant to break the spell of what they had witnessed. Michael approached Steve one more time, his eyes clearer than they had been when he'd arrived that morning. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady now. "For what?" "For helping me understand that grief isn't the opposite of love. It's love with nowhere to go, and you showed me that maybe it does have somewhere to go after all." He paused, looking back at the stage where everything had changed. "You know what the crazy thing is? I can almost hear him laughing about all this. Chad always said the best conversations happen when you stop trying to control them." 6 months later, Michael B. Jordan would establish the Chadwick Boseman Foundation for Young Artists, providing scholarships and mentorship for aspiring actors from underrepresented communities. In his speech at the foundation's launch, he would say, "My friend taught me that our legacies aren't built in the moments when we're remembered. They're built in the moments when we choose to remember others." The foundation's first scholarship recipient would be a young girl from South Carolina named Amara, who reminded Michael so much of the young actresses Chadwick used to mentor. When she hugged him at the ceremony, she whispered, "Thank you for keeping his light alive." It was then that Michael finally understood what Steve had tried to tell him in that studio. Love doesn't end, it multiplies. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't in the foundation or the public recognition. It was in the way Michael began ending his phone calls with friends and family. Where once he had hung up with casual goodbyes, now he always added 3 words, "I love you," because he had learned in the most public way possible that the words we think we'll have time to say later are the ones that matter most today. The Family Feud episode aired exactly as it happened, unedited and unfiltered. It became the most watched episode in the show's history, not because of celebrity appearances or game show drama, but because millions of people recognized their own grief and found their own healing in watching 2 men choose vulnerability over performance. The episode sparked a phenomenon that social media would later call "finish the conversation." People sharing stories of words left unsaid, love unexpressed, forgiveness withheld. Therapists reported an increase in clients seeking help, not for pathology, but for courage. The courage to have difficult conversations while there was still time. The hashtag trended for weeks, becoming a movement of connection in a world that had grown increasingly isolated. Steve Harvey would later say it was the most important conversation of his career. "That wasn't television," he reflected in a subsequent interview. "That was life happening in front of cameras. And sometimes life is more important than any show." The episode would go on to win a Daytime Emmy. But Steve would always insist the real award was watching Michael learn to smile again. Not the practiced smile of celebrity, but the genuine smile of a man who had found peace. The question Michael asked that day, "What happens when forever gets cut short?" found its answer not in words, but in the understanding that true friendship doesn't end with death. It transforms, becoming the foundation upon which the living build their own legacies of love. In the end, Michael learned what Steve Harvey already knew, that the most profound conversations happen not when we have all the answers, but when we're brave enough to ask the questions that matter most. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give someone isn't advice or solutions, but simply the space to be human in a world that often demands we be anything else. The lights in the Family Feud studio dimmed that night on more than just another episode. They dimmed on a moment when entertainment stopped and humanity began. When 2 men reminded America that beneath every smile, every performance, every public face beats the heart of someone who has loved and lost and learned to love again.